Samantha wakes up in a hospital bed to find her hands bound by soft fabric restraints, with Samuel watching over her. Her feelings for Samuel are complicated, a mix of hatred and an undeniable place in her heart. Samuel's questions plunge her into silence. Does he truly understand Samantha's fears and pain? Can they find a way to reconcile? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 26. Faking Riley was behind me in an instant. We both watched with bated breath as Samuel's eyes peacefully fluttered open. He was still for just a moment before everything came crashing down onto his consciousness. His eyes suddenly widened and his muscles tensed, ready to attack the first thing they saw. Riley's voice instantly came from behind me. "Samuel, it's all right. It's over." Samuel's eyes darted up to Riley, but before he could respond, he saw me. His frantic gaze softened immediately as he scanned me once over. He propped himself up on one elbow as he did so, bringing his other hand to rub the length of his face. I watched him timidly, very aware of Riley standing directly behind me, his feet digging into my hips. Samuel continued staring at me and I stared back. I wasn't sure what to say and it seemed he wasn't either. His expression held 1,000 different emotions, changing to a different one with each passing second. The one that seemed to keep coming back around though was confusion. What exactly happened? He finally asked. I watched the firelight dance across Samuel's furrowed brows. He flicked his gaze to me, scanning my body once again, almost in disbelief. I lowered my eyes after a while, rubbing my arms and shifting under his gaze. Riley's threats were still fresh in my mind, but I had no idea what to do with that knowledge or Samuel as a whole. It was obvious how Samuel felt and what he wanted, but I'd spent so long resisting him I didn't know how to do anything else, even if it was a feigned reaction. Riley spoke up. "One of 'em shot you damn close to your heart. Twice." He paused and nodded his head. "And after that, well, I dragged you here. Everyone else finished them off. Bray is gone now to make sure there's no one left." I tensed. Riley had failed to mention that was where Peyton, or as they called him, Bray, had gone. Were they really planning on killing every last human out here? I didn't get the chance to mull it over too long before Samuel noticed my apprehensive state. He reached a hand towards my leg as if to rest it there. However, he got halfway to my body before he froze and retracted his hand, thinking better of his action. He brought his arm back to rest at his side, but his eyes still lingered on my body. "What about you?" He finally prodded me. I hesitated, looking away. I wasn't sure how he'd react when I told him I'd run off again, specifically against his orders. Noticing my pause, Riley spoke up. "She came back with me. We've been waiting for you to wake up. It's been a lovely time, really." Samuel stilled, his eyes the only thing moving. They kept scanning my face, once again in disbelief. "You didn't run." I furrowed my eyebrows and started to answer, but Riley cut me off. "She didn't. Like I said, she came back with me." It was my turn to be confused. I wanted to turn and ask Riley what he was playing at, but I didn't get the chance. His foot smoothly dug into my hip, applying a small pressure. He didn't voice anything, but I knew what he was trying to say. If I told Samuel the truth, I'd pay the price. I looked up to see Samuel staring at me expectantly. I took a deep breath, modeling my words after Riley. What he said hadn't been a lie, it just wasn't the entire story. He'd caught me running in the woods, but I had come back with him to the safe house. Samuel didn't need to know it was unwillingly and unconscious. I came back with Riley. The sentence came out smoother than I expected, surprising even myself. Samuel had been listening carefully to my answer, but as soon as I spoke, his face slowly twisted into a wide and lopsided grin. His expression lit up his entire face and made him into a new person. It was infectious, and had I been in any other situation I would have smiled, too. He shook his head slightly, watching me with a glint in his dark eyes. They lit up with his new expression, and for the first time, I noticed small specks of blue dancing around his irises. As soon as I noticed, though, he finally broke eye contact and tilted his head up to Riley. He'd been watching Samuel closely, but the minute he started smiling, Riley noticeably relaxed. Riley looked down at Samuel and laughed once. "You know, you look like shit, Samuel." Samuel returned the gesture. "I could say the same for you." He paused, flitting his eyes over me. "Both of you, actually. Riley suddenly started to retreat from behind me, waving his hand lazily. As he spoke, he moved back to the other corner of the room to sit down. Yeah, well, we can't all be as pristine as Bray. Samuel barked out a laugh. It was sudden and abrupt and caught me slightly by surprise. I managed to hold back a flinch, but Samuel noticed my muscles tensing. He lowered his voice somewhat as he responded. Where is he anyway? I told you he's finishing them off. I told him to find that leader too. I have a couple questions for her. He sighed, placing his hands behind his head and closing his eyes. I tried not to think about his words, tried not to let them affect me. But questions kept running through my mind. Did he mean they went back to the other safe house? Did they kill every last person out here? I shuddered at the thought. Some of those people were mere children and innocent in all of this. Most of them, in fact, had nothing to do with Demaria's plan. They'd only been the families that made up the rest of the group. Samuel was quiet and I noticed him watching me carefully. He was probably preparing himself for the impending explosion of my emotions. However, I managed to keep a level face. I forced the pictures of all the innocent people out of my mind and let a dark, numbing sensation take over. How are you feeling? He asked me after a while, his eyes never leaving my face. I noticed he stared me down quite a lot, but I knew now wasn't the time to call him out on it. But that didn't stop me from wishing he would look away to give me a single moment to myself. Fine, I lamely told him. He cocked his head to the side, raising his eyebrows. Clearly I was not fine and he could see right through my facade. I heard Riley start to move behind me and panic crept into my heart. My chest tightened as my heart rate increased, and I was sure it was the only thing Samuel could now hear. I tried desperately to slow it and not to look behind me, calming myself with reassuring thoughts. Samuel just had to think everything was normal. It wasn't that hard. My side hurts, I blurted out. He furrowed his eyebrows and looked at my blood-soaked clothes. Samuel shook his head, calling over my shoulder. Riley, how long are we staying here? We're staying the night. That'll give you enough strength and Bray enough time, he simply stated. Samantha needs to get back. She needs medical attention, he started, but I quickly cut him off. I'm fine, really. I can manage the night. You were shot too. More than me, actually, and probably with Silver. You need time to heal, I rambled. I just need some sleep, that's all. Samuel looked at me skeptically. I plastered a smile on my face though, not allowing any other emotion through. Sure, my side burned and ached like nothing else. Sure, I wanted to collapse and sleep for weeks. Sure, I was beginning to feel like passing out. But I couldn't let that show. Riley laughed. She sounds fine to me. Samuel groaned and shifted his weight, lying on his back once more. He stared up at the ceiling and the minute his eyes left mine, I let my smile fall and closed my eyes. Everything threatened to seep in, but I pushed it back. I couldn't lose it. I felt Riley's gaze on me, and no matter how desperately I wanted to avoid it, I turned my head to look back. Sure enough, his red eyes were burning holes into me. He had a deadly expression on his face, and to be honest, it made me want to flinch. But I held his fixed stare. 1,000 threats were poured into his facial expression, and he didn't need his voice to make them known. When I finally realized he wasn't going to look away, I slowly brought my head to face Samuel again. He was still staring intently at the ceiling as if deep in thought. I held back a sigh and moved to mimic his position. Honestly, the ceiling was a much better view than Riley's cold glares. Samuel didn't move as I laid down a small distance away from him. I stayed close to the fire so I figured he wouldn't take it personally. The minute I was lying on my back, I felt as if I never wanted to sit up again. Sleep tugged at my eyes, but I refused to let it take me just yet. I didn't want to be sleeping when I was trapped with two werewolves who were wide awake. Several silent minutes passed until I was sure both Samuel and Riley were resting. Just as I was allowing myself to slip into unconsciousness as well though, Samuel's whispers echoed in my ears. Are you really okay? It took a moment for me to answer, but I eventually whispered a small "I will be." Was Riley telling the truth? I furrowed my eyebrows, looking in Riley's direction. Samuel heard my unvoiced concern and again softly spoke. He's asleep. I nodded to myself, thinking of Samuel's question. I was more awake now, but it still confused me. Can't you tell if he's lying? It's harder with werewolves. Oh, I breathed. I thought carefully for a moment, delicately wording my next sentence. He was right. I came here with him. Samuel was silent for a moment. Why? His question caught me off guard. 1,000 responses flew into my mind, but before I could stop myself, I blurted out the poorest one possible. I don't know. He laughed once. I don't get you, Samantha. A smile tugged at my lips. Honestly, I don't either. Well, what am I supposed to do about that? I held back a sigh. The last thing I wanted to do was banter with Samuel. That's your problem. Samuel laughed again. I don't see that as much of a problem. More like a challenge. I forced a laugh but didn't say anything. Silence fell for a few minutes. It crept in and filled every crevice of our small room until it was the only thing I could hear. I knew Samuel wasn't asleep yet for whatever reason, and it was slowly driving me mad. Finally I spoke. I had things I wanted to know, and now with Riley asleep was the best time to ask. Where is Peyton? Riley said he's off in the forest. I bit my lip. Taking care of the rest of them. Samuel was silent for a moment before he reluctantly responded. Yes. All of them. All of them, he sighed. Horror crept into my heart, but I tried to keep my voice level. What's the point? What do you mean? I mean, why would you kill all of them? The children? The families? Not all of them had something to do with it. Samuel didn't answer for a long time. For a while I didn't think he would. But finally, after several tense minutes, his voice stiffly came out. It doesn't matter to Riley. They were all technically part of the human resistance. Does it matter to you? What I want doesn't matter. I'm not the alpha, he whispered heavily. I furrowed my eyebrows, opening and closing my mouth several times. There were so many things wrong with what he said, so many retorts I wanted to spit out, but I didn't think I could tell him any of them. Riley might be asleep, but once he woke up it wouldn't be hard for him to know I'd upset Samuel. Samuel stayed silent, patiently waiting for me to explode. I shook my head once more just to make sure I wouldn't before I spoke again. So what's the plan now? Now. He paused, surprised at my change of topic. Right now we should be sleeping. I sighed. I meant tomorrow. I could almost hear him shrug. Not sure. Go back home, I guess. Get you to the doctor. My heart stung at the word home. We were going back to where we lived, but I was sure I would never see it as home again. When I didn't respond, Samuel shifted his weight and let out a long breath. Look, I just don't know what's going to happen. I haven't talked to Riley about you yet. It's fine, I softly replied. I didn't know what else to say. No, it's not really. I want to talk about things. The tone of his voice raised slightly as he continued. Can we talk tomorrow? About everything. About us. I closed my eyes, willing back the tears. Never had I planned for there to be an us to talk about. Now it seemed it was beyond inevitable, and I'd have to fake every last word. Of course. Chapter 27, Pain and Panic. I woke up in the early hours of the morning, countless nightmares fresh on my mind. I was breathing heavily, sprawled out on my back, with my limbs folding over my chest. The fire next to me had died long ago, and small rays of sunlight were emerging from the treetops outdoors. Beads of sweat fell across my forehead, but I quickly wiped them away, thinking only of the images flashing through my weary mind. Sleep had come quickly last night. After Samuel finally let me be, I'd listened carefully to his measured breathing. Once I was sure he was passed out, I followed. However, it wasn't a peaceful slumber I slipped into. Countless and torturous dreams tormented me. Images of my family, bloody and lifeless, were the main themes. In more than one nightmare, I was the one that had killed them. I was tired. Even though I slept, I didn't know how much rest I'd actually gotten. After each nightmare, I'd wake up only to find I was still in the small cement house, still sleeping next to a dying fire. Though I was always shivering, I'd be covered in sweat. When I would finally fall back asleep, another nightmare would ensue. This caused a vicious cycle, the visions only getting exceedingly horrifying and twisted as the night went on. Riley and Samuel never noticed my constant wakings, and I made sure to keep it that way. Surprisingly, I'd gotten quite skilled at staying quiet. However, with the images of my bloody family plaguing my mind, I wasn't sure how much longer I would last. I was suddenly pulled from my thoughts when I heard an abrupt and loud noise right outside the door. I whipped my head to the worn-down wood, watching carefully for any sign of movement. At the same time, Riley shot up from his position in the far corner of the room, readying himself for any sign of danger. Samuel immediately followed, placing himself directly in front of me. When the door started to open though, they both visibly relaxed. My eyebrows furrowed at their sudden change of demeanor, and I painfully lifted myself to my knees to peer around Samuel's wide frame. Sure enough, the door was fully opened and the morning dew was starting to seep inside. Just beyond the door were 3 figures, though only one of them was standing. When I tried to get a better look at the others, my gaze was cut off by the first form walking towards us. When I saw who the large figure belonged to, I understood Riley and Samuel's instant relief. Peyton Bray was slowly walking into the house, quickly closing the door once he was inside. I immediately noticed he was covered in dirt and missing his shoes. His clothing was slightly torn and his bright blue eyes were tired. This didn't take away from his overpowering presence though, and when he walked through the doorway he seemed to take up the entire room. "Bray, it's about damn time," Riley suddenly growled. "Sorry, Alpha," he strained. "I ran into some problems." He jerked his head behind him, causing Samuel and Riley to follow the motion. Riley nodded, looking back to Peyton. "Why didn't you call?" "It wasn't anything I couldn't handle," he shrugged, slowly relaxing. Riley laughed. "Obviously. What happened?" It was then that Peyton's gaze rested on me, crouching behind Samuel. His cold eyes held mine in a tight hold, never allowing me to leave. It was only a moment he looked at me, but it felt like much, much longer. Deciphering what his gaze held was impossible, and I soon felt the overwhelming need to apologize for even trying. "Maybe we should talk outside," he started, finally looking away. Samuel shifted his weight, glancing down at me. Riley did the same, casually nodding. He didn't say anything but walked past us all and through the door. Peyton quickly followed him, leaving me alone with Samuel. "What was that about?" I quietly asked, falling back to sit on the hard floor. Samuel turned to face me, taking in my ragged state. He shrugged his shoulders in response, not bothering to say anything. I watched him carefully as he started picking up the various things that littered the small room, piling them into bags he pulled from the back. As he worked, all evidence of us spending the night was gradually disappearing. A few silent minutes passed and I could tell Samuel was listening to the conversation happening outside. His face was twisted in concentration, and though he continued packing our belongings, he was distracted. I waited for him to become fully immersed in their conversation before I tensed my muscles, ready to try and stand. I knew from the start it would be difficult, and I didn't want Samuel hovering over me while I made the attempt. I was too stubborn and prideful to admit I needed help anyway. Of course I failed miserably. My legs gave out and I stumbled to the side, catching my weight on my bad wrist. A mangled cry left my mouth, immediately notifying Samuel of my failed attempt. I desperately tried to readjust myself and play it off, but Samuel was by my side in an instant. He quickly pulled me up from the ground and led me to the small seat of the windowsill. I leaned against it, half sitting and breathing heavily, as Samuel regarded me with concern. "You're not looking good," he mumbled, almost to himself. "Thanks," I muttered. I rolled my eyes before bringing my gaze to the floor. He didn't even know the half of it. I shifted under his intense stare as both of my hands went absently to my side. They'd grow accustomed to resting there, always attempting to ease the constant burning of the gunshot. Samuel followed my motion, his eyes narrowing in on my wound. "We'll get that taken care of when we get back." I stayed silent, not really believing him. If anything waited for me back home, it was more pain. Samuel started to say something, but he was quickly cut off when the door opened. Riley walked through, glancing at the two of us before running his gaze around the room. "Bray is pulling the car up now," he stated. Samuel sprang into action, picking up the large backpacks that now scattered the floor. Riley helped him with a few, not bothering to acknowledge me. They both left the room for a minute and I began to wonder if I was expected to follow. Just as I was gathering my strength to walk, Samuel came back in. He held out his hands and stepped towards me. Knowing I had no other options, I took one of his arms in both of my hands, gripping tightly for support. He brought his other arm around my waist, supporting the weight I couldn't manage. Then slowly he led me out of the house. It was a beautiful morning, and that was an understatement. The trees seemed to glisten with morning dew as rays of sunlight broke through their thick branches. The grass was slightly wet and bright green, with small clumps of weeded flowers scattered to the tree-line. From there they broke off and crept up the rough bark of the trees, molding the scenery into one perfect portrait. I didn't get too long to admire the rare sight before Riley was in front of us, ruining my perfect moment with his red eyes and wide smirk. I tried to hold back a sigh, but it seemed he was too preoccupied to notice any resentment on my part. He regarded Samuel with pursed lips, an unvoiced thought lingering there. "Peyton's bringing the truck," he finally spoke, his words coming out slow and careful. Samuel nodded, understanding flashing across his face. Before he could respond though, Riley spoke again. "He's got a load in the back," he stressed. "What I asked him to grab." Samuel scrunched his face in confusion, watching Riley carefully. I mimicked his actions, noticing Riley's unusually cryptic words. However, after a moment, understanding dawned on Samuel. He was silent, furrowing his eyebrows in concentration. Samuel's eyes darted to mine for a quick moment as he finally responded. "There's some blankets back in the house." Riley smirked again and nodded, casually strolling past us and back into the Whitestone building. I watched him for a moment before Samuel began pulling me forward, diverting my attention. "What was that about?" I asked slowly. Samuel shrugged. "Nothing." Annoyance tugged at my heart and I couldn't help but grow heated from his response. My carefulness was out the window, quickly replaced with my temper. "Obviously it's something. You just won't tell me." He glanced back at the building and sighed. "Look, it's nothing. Bray brought the truck, so I'm going to sit with you in the back. There's not enough room up front." And I deadpanned. "And nothing," he spoke lightly. "Riley's got some stuff back there and wanted to know how to make the ride more comfortable. Don't read too much into it." I raised my eyebrows, my lips forming a tight line. Before I could retort, Riley was back in front of us. I jumped at his unexpected and prompt arrival. He smiled lightly, glancing at Samuel before clearly noticing my irked expression. "Trouble in paradise," he mocked. Samuel scoffed and I quickly darted my gaze to the grass, hiding my annoyance. I could feel Riley's eyes on me though, and I knew the message his sentence implied. I had to make Samuel happy, not give him trouble. "No matter," Riley spoke after an awkward silence. "Bray's ready, come on." He started walking to the other side of the building and Samuel and I immediately followed. When we came to the opposite end of the clearing, a large truck was pulling up from a gap in the trees. It was white with a small two-person cabin and an extended back half. Peyton jumped from the front seat and moved to the back, lifting a latch to raise the sliding metal door covering the trunk. Samuel guided us to where Peyton stood and we stopped just as he finished lifting the door. Inside the truck was dark and stuffy. Various things were scattered along the floor, everything pushed up to the walls. A few small items had fallen from their place though, littering the floor. I quickly scanned the items, searching for anything suspicious or covered in blankets. My eyes rested on a small heap to the left of the truck where multiple blankets covered what was underneath. "You ready?" Samuel suddenly asked. I was brought back to the moment as Samuel removed his arm from my shoulder, causing me to stagger slightly. He quickly steadied me though, holding firmly to my arms. Feeling eyes on me, I glanced up to see Peyton curiously watching Samuel's gentle grasp. Peyton suddenly spoke. "Really is true then." Samuel glanced up at Peyton only to see he was staring at me once more. I avoided his gaze though, knowing it would hold me captive and cause fear to quickly rise. Instead, I watched Samuel's face flash with an untold emotion. "Of course it's true." Peyton shrugged, putting his hands in his pockets. "It's hard to believe. You can't blame me." Samuel paused, thinking for a moment. "I wouldn't believe it myself if it didn't happen to me." He laughed once, adjusting his grip on my arms. I tried following their conversation, but once again I felt eyes on me. I looked up to see Riley standing a few feet away, arms crossed and eyes blazing. He was staring me down, forcing every threat possible into one look. I flinched back, wishing I hadn't looked up in the first place. Samuel noticed and took the motion for pain. "Let's get you in, Samantha," Samuel softly spoke. He nodded to Peyton, who returned the gesture before walking back around the truck. When he was gone, Samuel's gaze softened, resting on me. He searched my features, smiling sadly. "This is probably going to hurt." Before I could respond, he picked me up, one arm under my legs and the other supporting my back. I gasped in shock and pain at his sudden movements, but as quickly as it happened, I was released once more. Confused, I opened my eyes. I hadn't realized I'd shut to see I was at the back of the truck, leaning against the hard metal surface. Samuel was back at the entrance, quickly sliding the door back down. When he did, I was overcome with complete and suffocating darkness. I could hear Samuel's footsteps coming back towards me, and I suddenly wanted nothing more than to be far, far away from him. I don't know if it was the darkness, my pain, or the uncertainty of the entire SU, but something inside of me was threatening to snap. I tried desperately to keep my breathing steady and my heart rate normal. However, the closer he came, the faster they both went. When he was standing in the space in front of me, I was close to having a panic attack. "Samantha, what's wrong?" Samuel asked, quickly crouching in front of me. I couldn't see his face, but I suddenly felt his hand on my leg. I flinched violently, scooting back further into the wall. The movements hit my side and I gasped in pain, willing the sensation to the back of my mind. I couldn't deal with both pain and panic. I knew that Samuel was confused and I could hear his soft words attempting to soothe me. However, my breaths were already being cut short. I'd breathed in as much air as my lungs could hold, but it didn't seem as if I could exhale. I tried, but each time I did, my lungs wouldn't comply. Suddenly, it felt as if I was suffocating. My hands reached up to my chest, pushing against my heart and neck, trying hopelessly to make my body obey my mind. Then suddenly it was light again. It wasn't the same light as before, but a white and unnatural glow that cast harsh shadows. I blinked several times as my eyes adjusted. When they did, I saw Samuel was still crouched in front of me, but he was holding a small phone in his hand, the white light coming from the tip. Now that I could finally see, my heart decided to start calming down. My lungs shakily exhaled the air they'd taken on, and when they did, I realized how dizzy I suddenly was. When Samuel saw my head spin, he carefully moved to sit next to me, holding the phone steadily in his hand. I barely noticed his movements as I could only focus on further calming myself down. After several tense and quiet moments, I finally heaved a large sigh. My hands left my chest and rested in my lap as I fumbled with my fingers. Samuel was still sitting next to me, unmoving. I dared a glance in his direction, only to find he was staring right at me the entire time. I shied away from his intrusive stare, looking instead at my feet. His voice met my ears barely above a whisper. "Are you all right? What happened?" I shook my head. The last thing I wanted to do was talk, but I knew he wouldn't let me ignore him. "I don't know. It just got dark," and I sighed, searching for an answer to my anxiety. I soon found there wasn't one. "I don't know." Samuel nodded, shifting his weight and slowly bringing a hand to mine. I tried not to flinch, but I was suddenly so overcome with exhaustion it wasn't hard. "Sorry. I should have thought about that." The truck suddenly started moving. I whipped my head up, looking around as various small objects fell haphazardly to the ground. Samuel noticed them too and let out a small laugh, trying to diffuse the tension. He watched me anxiously, waiting for me to break down once more. I managed a small smile to let him know that for the moment I was all right. As the truck bounced along the road, several more items bounced with it. I watched warily as backpacks slipped, supplies falling from their contents. One smaller bag fell on the heap on the far side of the truck and bounced lightly to the ground. I watched, confused, as it pulled a piece of blanket along with it. My eyes widened at what I saw when the blanket had been pulled away. A cold chill ran up my spine and a large pit settled in my stomach. My face paled and my hands went slack, no longer mindlessly fidgeting with my shirt. "Samantha?" Samuel questioned, following my gaze. When his eyes rested on what I saw, his face flashed with apprehension. He tried speaking again, but I was already gone. There was nothing that could pull me away from the thing sticking out from the blanket. Nothing that would erase the image from my mind. Nothing that would stop the fear seeping into my skin. It was lying limply in the air as if suspended by invisible strings. Blood was seeping through, dripping to the metal floor. The shadows from Samuel's light only aided in the dead and cold aura emanating from its tips. "A hand." Chapter 28. "I didn't want to freak you out," I screamed. I don't know how it sounded because honestly I could no longer hear. All of my senses were focused on what appeared to be part of a dead body lying only feet away from me. My legs flailed, pushing me as far away from the hand as possible. I vaguely registered Samuel helping me along the wall and calling out my name, but I didn't answer him. Then suddenly he left my side. He'd laid the phone beside me and I grabbed it quickly, holding to the light for dear life. I followed Samuel's movements and watched as he forcefully pulled the blankets around the hand, adjusting whatever else was under the material. When he came to sit next to me again, he rested his fingers on my arm. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes were still trained on the place I'd seen the gory hand and they never wanted to leave. Though I could only view the dark material of the blankets now, I knew what was underneath. Nothing could shield that anymore. I suddenly felt a small pressure on my chin, pulling my face to the side. Before I knew what was happening, I was staring into the eyes of Samuel. His fingers gripped my chin, just hard enough to hold my face in place. "Samantha, look at me," Samuel's voice came out gently. I reluctantly did as I was told. My eyes stopped darting to the side but instead focused on the face before me. Familiar dark eyes, stubbled chin, wide nose. The longer I stared, the more that I surprisingly calmed down. It seemed as if focusing on Samuel's features forced my brain to think of something other than the limb hanging in my memory. Samuel eventually dropped his hand but I didn't divert my gaze. I took a deep breath, searching his features for an explanation. "What was that?" I slowly asked despite knowing exactly what it was I saw. Samuel closed his eyes and sighed and I somehow knew he was about to play it off. Before he got the chance to speak, I interrupted. "Don't you dare tell me it was nothing. That wasn't nothing. I'm not stupid." He opened his eyes and let a small smile leak onto his face. "I guess I should have seen that one coming." "Samuel," I snapped. He sighed, the smile disappearing as quickly as it came. "I don't know what to tell you, Samantha. How about you start with why there was a bloody hand under a pile of blankets? I didn't want you to freak out." "Great job you did there," I scoffed, finally breaking my gaze away. I looked down to my lap, suddenly not wanting to face the rest of the truck. We were still bouncing along the dirt road and things were continuously being thrown around. There was no guarantee the blanket hadn't shifted again. "Why are you carting dead bodies around?" Samuel stilled, shock lining his face. He thought for a moment before painfully uttering his next words. "They're not dead, Samantha." My expression followed his, though fear melded with my shock as well. "What?" He shook his head, glancing up at the spot I was avoiding. "Bray found them. Riley wants some answers. They're human." I practically whispered, panic creeping up my spine. "Yes, but you don't need to worry. They won't hurt you," he quickly spoke, misplacing my fears. "Bray will take care of them when we get back." I nodded, biting my bottom lip. It wasn't the humans I was worried about. The only thing running through my mind was the fact that if I didn't listen to Riley, the bloodied hand and unconscious body would easily be mine. "Who is it?" I suddenly asked, recalling the countless faces of Demaria's people. "I can't tell you that." I shook my head, pushing away my annoyance. However, Samuel clearly saw through my weak facade. "It's not that I don't want to tell you. Riley just doesn't want anyone to know. We're not even telling the pack." My interest piqued. "How does that work?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, how would they not know? They're everywhere." Samuel laughed, folding his arms in his lap. "It does seem like that, doesn't it? Why wouldn't you tell them?" I tried again, ignoring how he danced around my previous question. "Riley just doesn't want everyone freaking out," he shrugged. "There were a lot more people with Damaria than we originally thought. He doesn't want the pack to panic." "I agree." I furrowed my eyebrows. That made no sense. Why on earth would they panic? They were just humans. His tone hardened. "Humans can do a lot of damage." I bit my lip once more, staying silent for several long minutes. Samuel didn't seem too intent on starting up a conversation either, because he'd taken back his phone and was typing away on the screen. His movements were foreign and out of place, but I didn't comment on it. The only time I'd ever interacted with Samuel was when he was following me or traversing through the woods, so it was hard to think of him doing anything different. But now that I thought about it, it only made sense. Everyone had phones. Well, everyone but me. "You should sleep," Samuel eventually commented, finally laying his phone down. He kept the light on, something I greatly appreciated. "It's going to be a few hours." I tilted my head. How far are we? Maybe 3 hours from the edge of town. A bit longer after that. I meant how far distance-wise. He paused, pursing his lips and thinking. I'm not sure. Maybe close to a little over 100 miles out. Why? I ignored him, a small smile spreading across my face. Even though I was caught running, I'd gotten pretty far. Granted, most of the miles traveled were in a car with Kate, but I'd walked a fair distance too. It was hard not to be proud of my small accomplishment, even if it didn't mean anything anymore. What are you smirking about? Samuel suddenly asked. I darted my gaze up to him for a small moment. My smirk widened a bit more as I used Samuel's method against him. It's nothing. He laughed. It wasn't forced or strained, but a full-sounding bark that echoed through my ears. Touché, Samantha. Touché. We fell into a comfortable silence. I had no intent on breaking it and was even debating trying to sleep again. However, the thought of Samuel catching me in a nightmare was enough to keep me awake. Samuel eventually broke the silence, much to my dismay. We should talk. About what? I slowly asked. About what happened. I know you're still upset with me. I stilled. I wasn't quite ready to have this conversation. Yes, I knew exactly how I felt and where I stood, but I also knew that I could share none of it with Samuel. Not anymore. Not now that Riley had threatened my family. I started fidgeting with my hands, picking at the skin on my fingers. What's there to talk about? He sighed. It was long, tired, and heavy. Look, I'm sorry for the things I said. It was uncalled for. I was pissed off and not thinking. I was confused for a moment before I remembered our encounter where I'd finally snapped. It was just after I realized Samuel lied to me, and I was beyond furious. To be honest, the conversation was still raw in my mind. The deception was as fresh as the wound on my side. It's fine, I started, hiding my face from his and trying not to cringe at my next words. I'm sorry too. Samuel shifted his position. Really? I paused. His voice reminded me of a small child waiting anxiously for a parent's praise. Was it really this easy to fool him? Finally, I laughed once, trying to hide my discomfort. I guess so. What? No angry insult. Samuel chuckled. Don't push me, I mused. From the corner of my eye, I saw him raise his hands in surrender. Done. I don't think I could face that again anyway. It was terrifying. I rolled my eyes. Right. He continued laughing. No, I'm serious. You could be a seriously scary she-wolf. My body tensed. My nerves skyrocketed. His comment replayed in my mind over and over again. No matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't leave and I couldn't relax. It had been an innocent remark, but it insinuated something far from it. I'm not a wolf. I tried not to seethe, but I wasn't too successful. Samuel unmistakably noticed my sudden change. Look, I was just making a joke, he quickly backtracked. I didn't mean anything by it. It's fine, I responded a little too quickly, folding my arms across my chest. I held myself tightly, forcing back every emotion possible. Once I was sure my rashness wouldn't get the better of me, I slowly repeated myself. It's fine. Samuel sighed, abruptly changing the subject. It was a smart move. You should try and get some sleep. The doctor wants to see you as soon as we're back. I gently nodded my head, leaning it against the wall next to me. The metal was cold against my cheek, but it was the good kind of cold. The kind that allowed you to focus on the numbness. Once that dominated my mind, fatigue quickly found me. Before I knew it, and despite my best efforts, I was falling asleep to the sounds of Samuel's breathing. Chapter 29. Just call me a saint. The drive was long. I didn't sleep no matter how much I tried. With each bump in the road, each nightmare that started, and each movement from Samuel, I was left more and more awake. So, I spent the time thinking instead. I thought about everything that happened previously and everything that was bound to follow our arrival back in town. The reality of the situation was pressing, and decisions needed to be made. So, I started with the small things and worked my way up. The least of my worries was that I would probably no longer be allowed to work or to go anywhere, for that matter. I would have no more freedom in any sense of the word. Samuel would never leave me. That much he promised. I needed to get used to his presence, which led directly to my next problem. I would probably be spending a lot more time with the wolves. If Samuel still insisted I move in with him, he'd probably be living with the rest of his kind. They would most likely all want to eat me alive. I was supposed to ignore this and push past my anger at Samuel, at Riley, at everyone. I'd have to do more than lie and fake emotion because they would see right through me. Riley would see right through me. There was no doubt in my mind Riley would constantly be watching me. That I was sure of. He'd monitor my every move and hold it over my head if I didn't live up to his expectations. Samuel had to be kept happy. If not, I wasn't the only one that would get hurt. At that, my thoughts turned to Riley's threats. His demands. It was in that moment, in the dark of the truck with Samuel distracted beside me, that I finally allowed myself to dwell on the fact that my humanity wouldn't last much longer. If Samuel wanted to turn me, I couldn't refuse. Riley wouldn't let me. If I were to even try, my own life would be the least of my concerns. I saved my biggest concern for last, knowing once I dwelled on this thought all others would cease. Of course, all other thoughts led me here anyway. My family. My small broken family. I couldn't help but think of the possibility of arriving back home only to find they were gone. Dead even. That thought broke me more than anything else could. They were all I had. I was hopeful that Riley hadn't harmed them, as I hadn't provoked him enough to do so. But they'd been left alone with James, and that was just as dangerous. These thoughts were enough to occupy my mind for days, so it wasn't surprising when enough time had passed and the truck was suddenly being opened. When the light flooded our surroundings, I wasn't given time to adjust, think, or move. Samuel scooped me up and brought me directly to the hospital. I was in the same hospital where Will resided, that much I knew. It was where all the humans were treated. Where I was, what floor or even what room was left a mystery. When Samuel brought me through the sliding doors, a whirlwind of people hit me. I vaguely recognized a few of their faces from when I visited Will, but none of them would look directly at me. They followed orders barked at them by Samuel, hurriedly preparing what was needed to make me whole again. They'd brought me to this room, placed me on the bed, and cleaned me up. It was absolute hell. They dressed and sewn up my gunshot wound, forced needled into my skin, pushed medicines down my throat, and mumbled about infection and treatments. I was a rag doll in their hands, a broken dish they were intent upon forcing back together. It seemed like lifetimes before they left. When they did, it was only after they were temporarily satisfied with the endless supply of fluids and pain medication dripping into my body. I was now lying back on the bed in a white gown with matching knitted blankets pulled up to my shoulders. I was supposed to be sleeping, but I was only fading in and out. For some reason, my body wouldn't let me fully relax. The reason couldn't be that Samuel was continuously staring at me from across the room. "Will you stop?" I finally called out, shifting the blanket around me. My sleep deprivation left me utterly exhausted and therefore short-tempered. I was normally able to ignore his intrusive stares, but today they were dominating my consciousness. In the beginning, after the rush of doctors started to recede, I thought Samuel would leave to be examined himself. But the hospital workers didn't so much as glance at him. He seemed to be in perfect health. To him it was as if the past week never happened. He smirked. "Stop what?" I crossed my arms, ignoring the wires that tangled around me. "You know what?" I grumbled. "You're supposed to be sleeping, you know." My eyes rolled dramatically. "I know." "Well, do you need something to help you?" He started to stand, motioning to someone through the open door. He quickly caught a nurse's eye and she began a slow trudge to my room. "No," quickly cried. He looked back at me curiously but didn't stop the nurse. I frantically continued. "No, I don't need anything. I'll fall asleep in no time. No time at all. No drugs needed," I rambled, waving my hand. To prove my point, I leaned my head back once more and pretended to get comfortable. Samuel stayed in place, continuing to watch me before he waved off the woman who came to the door. When she was gone, he slowly wandered to my bed. My body involuntarily tensed at his presence, but I tried not to let it show. So far, I'd put on a pretty good show of trust and I wasn't going to stop now. "You're acting a little crazy," he told me matter-of-factly. "Are you sure you don't want anything? I would stay here the whole time you were asleep." That's what I was afraid of. Being completely alone with Samuel while I was in a drug-induced sleep. I forced my body to relax and pushed out a yawn. "I'll be fine if you just stop staring." He chuckled, raising his hands in surrender. "Fine, fine. Anything for you." Samuel made his way back across the room to sit in the armchair he'd been occupying all afternoon. It was a light-colored wood with green cushions and seemed extremely out of place compared to everything else. The rest of the room was plain and colorless. My bed, the table designed to hover over me, even the equipment. A large window was to my right, but the curtains had been shut to hide the outside view. He settled himself in the uncomfortable chair and pulled out his phone. When I was sure he wouldn't move, I turned away from him and closed my eyes for what seemed like the 100th time. I was immediately met with visions of guns, fire, and bloodied family members. I was almost used to these pictures running through my mind by now, but they still stung, preventing me from even thinking about sleep. After only a few short minutes, I opened my eyes and trained them on the heart monitor sitting next to me. It beeped monotonously but kept track of the time passed. I let the rhythm to lull me into a numb state, where I was allowed to lay on the bed and pretend to be anywhere but here. Eventually, though I'm not sure how I fell asleep, it was once again fitful and nightmarish. When I woke up, the room was dark and the door was shut. A bright white light shone underneath the crack, illuminating the few pieces of furniture in the room with me. My gaze glanced over Samuel, who was still sitting in his chair, but now with his head slumped on his shoulder. I shook away the images remaining in my mind and pulled the blanket and countless cords off of my body. My feet swung around and hit the floor, and when I was ready, I pulled myself up to stand. I swayed only slightly, but for the most part, held a firm position. When I was sure I wouldn't fall, I quietly padded away from my bed and towards the bathroom door next to Samuel. The minute I got a foot away from my bed, though, something caught on my arm and fell to the ground. It crashed and bounced, sending an abrupt noise through the still and quiet room. Not another moment passed before Samuel was on his feet, searching the room wildly. I paused, ignoring Samuel, and half turned to glare at the tangled cord that knocked my cup of water to the floor. When I was sufficiently satisfied that nothing else would fall if I moved, I started towards the bathroom once more. I was stopped, however, by Samuel's broad frame stalking towards me. "What are you doing?" he called out. His voice held too many emotions: worry, concern, anger, and a touch of hurt. I was confused until I realized the scene he'd woken up to. It was the middle of the night and I was sneaking in the direction of the front door. The bathroom was right next to it, but of course that wouldn't be Samuel's initial thought. "I was just trying to go to the bathroom," I quickly muttered. He was beside me now, untangling a cord I hadn't noticed that was attached to my wrist. "Sorry." He looked at me warily, watching my lost expression. Finally, he shook his head and sighed. "Sure." I couldn't hold back my scoff. "If you're that worried about me running, then maybe you just tie me up. Works for everyone else. Stop being so dramatic." He rolled his eyes and tried to hold back a frown. His hand was still on my wrist, though the wire was long gone. He paused, eyes glancing over my expression as I shifted under his stare. I was still fuming at his comment, and I was certainly not holding back my glare. Eventually, though, he met my eyes and softened. "Come on, I'll help you to the bathroom." I let him help me to the door, where he waited patiently for me to finish my business. I gave myself enough time to compose my features and push back my anger. When I was through and ready to face Samuel, he carefully led me back to the bed and pulled the blankets around my shoulders. I leaned my head against the flat pillow and pressed a button that raised the back of the bed and allowed me to sit up. Samuel watched me warily, holding out his arms as if I was going to fall. "It's going to be hard to sleep sitting up, don't you think?" he asked after a while. I adjusted my pillow and closed my eyes, wishing I could ignore him. "I'm not tired. I got enough sleep." "I think we both know that's not true." I raised one eyebrow while opening my eyes to a slit. When I saw his hardened expression, I closed them again and remained silent. I was finding that it was easier to say nothing than to risk the wrong words escaping my mouth. Samuel slowly lowered himself to sit at the foot of my bed. His hand rested on my calf and I fought the urge to pull it away. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," I quickly responded. "Do you need any more pain medicine?" "No." "You'll tell me if you do." "No." "Sure." We fell into silence. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't filled with unease either. It was just there. Neither of us knew what to say, and I believed it was because neither of us knew what to do either. No matter how I tried, Samuel knew I was still upset with him. He'd known me long enough to realize I didn't let things go so easily. Why he wasn't confronting me about it wasn't something I was going to bring up. I listened to the soft hum of voices outside my room, trying to discern what they were saying. It passed a bit of time and allowed me to focus on something other than Samuel's fingers running along my lower leg. How long will I be here? I suddenly broke the silence, opening my eyes. They'd adjusted to the dark room now, and I was able to make out Samuel's features clearly. His main feature was exhaustion, and I could tell he needed several more hours of sleep before the bags under his eyes would disappear. He thought for a moment. I'm honestly not sure. They want to watch you and make sure everything is all right. There's a big chance your wound is infected. I'm fine, I started, but he quickly cut me off. Samantha, he deadpanned. You were shot. I huffed out a short breath. So were you. More than once, I believe. Yeah, well, I heal quickly, he muttered. It wasn't hard to tell he wasn't in the mood to argue. I quickly changed the subject, asking my next question before thinking it through. Can I see Will while I'm here? I paused after I asked, watching him carefully. His eyebrows raised and then furrowed, and I instantly regretted my outburst. This wasn't a question I wanted an answer to. He was quiet for a moment longer before slowly saying, I don't see why not. I stilled. Had I heard him right? No. There was absolutely no way. He'd never allow me to see my family after I ran. I was supposed to be rejected, put down, and banned from speaking for the rest of the night. Samuel noticed my astonishment. His lip twitched, hinting at a small smile. Did you really think I wouldn't let you see him? I'm not that big of a dick. Really? I started, my mind barely registering my words. His expression darkened and I quickly recovered, catching up with the conversation. Sorry, not about that last part. You're really okay with me seeing him? His face fell back to normal and he shrugged. Of course. I mean, you can't go alone, but you can still see him. A large smile slowly spread across my face. I never expected I'd be allowed contact with my family. Never thought that Samuel would allow me any relationship outside of his. Thank you, I breathed. When can I see him? He looked at the curtains. I guess when morning finally decides to show up. If possible, my smile spread further. Thank you, really, I repeated. This time a smile did appear on his face. I watched it light up his features like it had so many times before. He looked years younger with this expression, and it suited him greatly. Not that I would ever tell him that. Just call me a saint, he responded, waving his hands aimlessly. I tried to hold back a smile. Yeah, right. He looked at me with pure innocence, mock offense lining his amused expression. You don't think I'm a saint? You're a lot of things, Samuel, but I don't think a saint is one of them, I laughed. It was a loud noise, abrupt and foreign. I couldn't remember the last time that sound came from my lips. Samuel was slightly shocked as well, but he recovered quickly. You hurt me, Samantha. I rolled my eyes, my small fit of laughter dying off. When I looked up again, Samuel had his dark eyes trained on mine. They held something unreadable, some untold thought or emotion. I was suddenly reminded of the past week, the pain and betrayal from every corner. And it was as if the world came crashing down around me, reminding me that I had nothing to laugh for. I cleared my throat, quickly glancing away, trying to remain casual. You should get some sleep. You look worse than me. I shook my head, attempting to clear my thoughts. He shrugged and momentarily took his hand off my leg, stretching his arms high above his head. Nah, I'm great. Besides, if you're in a good mood, we could talk about some things. What things? I held back a groan. I hated talking about things. This might have worked moments ago, but now every time I looked at Samuel I could only think of the reasons I ran from him. Mirroring those thoughts were Riley's threats, constantly reminding me that if Samuel wasn't happy, my family would be hurt. I tried to hold back a sigh. This was impossible. Samuel let out a small laugh. Well, I talked to Riley about everything. I told him about you, your situation, everything. My heart skipped a beat and I almost missed his next words. He agrees that things are different because at least one of the reasons you ran was your father. Stepfather, I automatically mumbled. He shot me a look, to which I mumbled a quick sorry. It's fine, Samuel nodded. His hand moved to rest on my foot, where he rubbed small circles as he finished his explanation. He's decided to let you off pretty easy. I mean, considering you are a human and all, and you broke one of the biggest laws. His voice trailed off for a moment while he thought of his next words. I tried desperately to hold my tongue and push back my glares. He's giving you a small sentence. Simple house arrest for a few weeks. Maybe less. I stilled. House arrest. What did that even mean? Samuel noticed my confusion. It basically means you'll just be confined to a certain place under surveillance for a certain amount of time. Just one place. He nodded and I furrowed my eyebrows. So essentially, you're throwing me into a jail to rot away the rest of my days. Samuel's body stiffened slightly and he took a deep breath. When he spoke though, his voice was surprised and gentle. Of course not. It's called house arrest for a reason. So you're confining me to my house forever. No, he started, shifting his weight so he was sitting more fully on the bed. He paused the circular movements of his hand and gripped my foot lightly. My house. Chapter 30. I'm not so dense, the bastard. The sick, twisted, conniving, heartless bastard. Riley knew Samuel would come to him. He knew Samuel would ask what to do with me. And what had he suggested? That I be locked inside his house for an immeasurable amount of time, as punishment for something they deemed wrong. He was a genius. Even in my current state, I couldn't deny it. I would be a fool not to realize what this meant. If I was locked away with Samuel as my only contact, not only would I be forced to be with him, but he'd be given that much more access to my life. My humanity. The very thing I was trying desperately to hold on to. There would be no running, no stopping him. I would be rendered helpless to his will. Samuel watched carefully as countless thoughts and emotions crossed my features. I tried to keep my face numb and untelling, but it wasn't working. I knew it wasn't. My brain was sluggish, my body was tired, and I was coming to the ends of my ropes. Samuel read me like an open book. I knew he saw the pain and fear etched permanently in my eyes, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. No matter how hard I fought against it, how much willpower I had, or how many times I convinced myself I'd be all right. My resolve eventually had to end somewhere. Suddenly I was panicking. I didn't know why. I'd expected this punishment or at least something like it. I knew that the minute I stepped back into this town, Riley would cause me a world of hurt. He would make sure I was exactly what he and Samuel wanted. There was no way around it. So why was it that when my fate was finally revealed, I had wave after wave of panic, dread, and anxiety crash upon me? Tense minutes passed. I tried calming myself. I truly did. However, with each one gone, another piece of my mind followed. Samuel was silent. He didn't know what to say, I didn't know what to do, and the situation was quickly turning into an impending storm. Each minute, each second, signified one more wave pushing me further under a frenzied ocean. Samuel was at the surface, waiting while unbeknownst to him, I fought to breathe. My breaths were short and shaking in time with my hands. I planted them firmly in my lap, trying desperately to shield the tremors from Samuel's watchful eye. My heart was racing. The monitor beside me registered the accelerated pace. The beeping noise quickened until it sounded like one solid high-pitched drone. I didn't acknowledge it and prayed Samuel would do the same. He couldn't know what his words were doing to me. He couldn't. If he did, Riley would find out and we'd all be dead. Samuel opened his mouth, worry lines etching deeper into his skin. The smile he held before was nowhere to be seen, replaced instead with a man that had too many troubles. He looked at me with a pained expression as his body went stiff, watching intently as I slowly unraveled. When the heart monitor didn't calm down, he nodded to himself and smiled sadly at me. His gaze darted to the door, leading to the myriad of hospital staff. Before I could say anything, he called for them. Another wave hit me. This time it forced every last bit of air out of my lungs. I fought frantically to breathe in again, but it wasn't working. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't get air. There was nothing there. My hands snaked to my chest and throat where they clutched and pulled at my skin, fighting to find a new way to breathe. What happened? A woman suddenly spoke. I shot my gaze up to see a petite woman with short blonde hair. She was standing in the middle of the group of workers that had just flooded the room. They each had their gazes drilled into me, silently assessing my declining state. I flinched away from them, but they did not rush me like before. For whatever reason, they stood rooted in place. I suspected it had something to do with the werewolf sitting at the foot of my bed. "She's having another panic attack," Samuel started, moving to the side as he spoke. Only when he moved was I immediately engulfed in what seemed to be an endless number of people. A light was shone into my eyes the same moment my legs and arms were gripped by numerous hands. I quickly realized I was thrashing wildly, my arms and legs striking at whatever they could make contact with. I told my limbs to stop. I told myself to calm down. I told my lungs to breathe. But my head was spinning, nothing was making sense, and I still couldn't get any air. Eventually, things started to slow down. The nurses and doctors blurred. A sensation was slowly overtaking my senses, dragging me far away from the hospital bed. The blonde woman's face was suddenly over mine, and she was speaking softly. Though I couldn't make out the words, her voice sang a soft lullaby. The sound overcame and filled my thoughts. In the next moment, I could only see darkness. My eyes fluttered open suddenly. There was no gradual ease back into reality. Rather, it hit me like a freight train. I was still in the hospital, still in the same room. Nothing had changed from when they'd put me under, not even Samuel sitting in his chair. He was sleeping like the last time I awoke, and it almost felt as if nothing had happened. I could almost pretend Samuel and I never had a conversation. Almost. The memories moved slow as molasses, but they were there. They just weren't making sense. Then again, the only thing I could really focus on was my throat. It was burning, begging for liquid. I noticed the water on the table beside me and reached out to it instantly. When my hand lifted up, though, it met resistance. My eyes groggily traveled down my arm to stare at my wrist. It was loosely tied to the side of my bed with a soft fabric. When I attempted lifting my other arm, I found the same thing. I groaned loudly and gradually lifted myself up to a sitting position, staring confusedly at the two pieces of material binding me to the bed. Abruptly, I heard movement from across the room. By the time I lifted my head up, Samuel was beside me, eyeing me cautiously. I stared blankly back at him, my eyelids heavy and refusing to cooperate. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words would come out. Though this would normally bother me, I couldn't find it in me to care. The only thing I wanted was water. Suddenly, I felt his hand on my arm. It was strange, almost comforting, feeling his flesh so delicately resting upon my own. His hand was light and gentle, only resting there to give me reassurance. My eyebrows furrowed at the sensation, and I tried to sort through the reasons why I hated Samuel. "Samantha," he softly cooed. The hand lingering on my arm was brought up to my cheek. Unconsciously, I leaned into it. "Samantha, how do you feel?" Though I didn't move my head from his hand, my eyes glanced to the side where I'd seen the water. Samuel understood immediately and brought the cup to my lips, tilting it ever so slightly. The cool liquid fell into my mouth and ran down my throat, reviving me slightly. He placed the cup back on the table and sat next to me while pressing a button on my bed. After a few moments and creaking noises, I felt the support of my mattress behind me, allowing me to lean back. I quickly did so, adjusting my weight so I was comfortable. When I was settled, Samuel rested his hand on my thigh. Blankets and my hospital gown separated his flesh from mine, and I was suddenly wishing he'd hold my cheek once more. The thought was unsettling, and I quickly pushed it aside as exhaustion. "How are you feeling?" he softly asked. His frame was relaxed along with his features. Dark eyes searched my own. My thoughts were barely starting to become coherent. It took what felt like hours to comprehend his question, then another day to finally speak. When I did eventually respond, my tone was laced with confusion. "My wrists." I trailed off. My head rested on my shoulder and I stared down my arm to the soft material binding my limbs. Samuel smiled sadly. "We didn't know how you'd be when you woke up. Didn't want you hurting yourself." As he spoke, he reached forward and began untying the fabric. They were only loosely tied in the first place, so it wasn't hard for him to do. When the material was gone, I lifted my wrists to my face, examining them. Samuel chuckled lightly. "They must have really knocked you out. You're still pretty out of it, huh?" I narrowed my eyes, bringing one hand to hold the side of my head. "What happened?" My voice came out surprisingly smooth but notably quiet. He shrugged. "Nothing." I sighed heavily, and when his words registered, I used all my strength to glare at him. This only caused him to smile. "Just testing you," he smirked. "You had a pretty nasty panic attack. I had them sedate you." I nodded slowly. The molasses of my thoughts were starting to make sense. After a few silent moments, I quietly asked for more water. Samuel quickly gave me the cup again, but this time let me hold it myself. I greedily drank the entire thing, emptying the small plastic cup in seconds. "Do you want more?" he asked when I handed the cup back. I shook my head and offered a quiet no. He nodded, searching my features. "Can you tell me how you're feeling?" I took a quick mental inventory. The longer I was awake, the more my consciousness came back to me. I was no longer confused or slow to process things, I was just tired. Exhausted, I ultimately sighed. "You should get some more rest." Samuel took my hand lightly in his, keeping it placed in my lap. I didn't fight his grasp but decided to ignore it. How long was I asleep? I disregarded his request. He thought for a moment, frowning slightly. "A long time. You slept the entire day yesterday and most of the night. It's about to be morning." "That long?" I breathed, dumbfounded. "That long? You woke up a few times but you were never up for long." I shook my head in disbelief. I didn't think I'd ever slept that long in my life. "It makes sense," Samuel continued, lazily glancing around the room. "With all the medicine you're on and what happened, your body needs to recover. Maybe a sedative forced it to do just that." It sure didn't feel like my body had recovered. I guess I mumbled. "Did you sleep or did you stay here the whole time?" "I slept here," he stated simply, returning his gaze to mine. "I wanted to be here if you woke up or something happened." I bit my lip and nodded, bobbing my head to my chest. My hair fell across my features, hiding them like they'd done so many times before. "So," Samuel slowly started with a question in his voice. "You want to tell me what that was all about?" "What do you mean?" My voice was low, my face was hidden. "I mean, something set you off. You were just fine and then you weren't." "Oh," I managed half a whisper. I knew exactly what he was talking about, and in my half-awake state, I couldn't find it in me to argue with him. "Will you tell me about it?" His question caught me off guard. It wasn't a demand or even a request. It was a plea to reveal my innermost thoughts we both knew were deep-rooted fears. "I'm tired, Samuel," I eventually answered. Not only did I not have it in me to argue with him, but I also didn't have the strength to open this tightly shut box or pretend to be something I wasn't fine. He slowly nodded. "I know. I just want to know what you're thinking. I'm not so dense that I couldn't figure out what set you off." It was silent while he waited for me to gather my thoughts. I brought my head from my chest to lean against the mattress, where I stared at the wall beside Samuel's shoulders. "It's just a lot," I tried to explain without revealing too much. "My family too. They're taken care of." I shook my head. "You don't understand." "I do," he quickly cut me off, squeezing my hand. "I've taken care of it. I knew you'd be upset and asking about your mother. I sent someone over there to check on her." He had my immediate attention. I brushed my hair aside and my wide eyes landed on his. They were filled with tenderness and understanding. "She's fine." One corner of his lips tilted up. "Her husband is gone." I paused. "Gone?" He nodded. "No one knows what happened. Your mother said he disappeared a few hours before we got back." I let that information slowly sink in. James was gone. Supposedly vanished. It didn't make sense. "Why?" I eventually asked. Samuel was momentarily confused. "Why what? Why would he just run off like that?" I shook my head, furrowing my eyebrows. He had no reason to run before, no matter how much we all wished he would disappear. The only thing that changed was Samuel, and as far as I knew, James had no idea about him. Samuel suddenly lowered his gaze. I might have asked someone to retrieve him for me. He must have caught wind. I blinked a few times, his voice swimming in my ear. "You did what?" I asked in disbelief. "I asked someone." I held up my hand that he wasn't holding, cutting him off. "I heard what you said. Why did you do that?" He shrugged, trying to maintain his casual appearance. However, his gaze stayed averted. "I knew it was important to you. I've had a lot of time to think, especially on the drive back." I was silent. If I wasn't being careful, my jaw would have been on the floor. His words were registering in my mind, but I wasn't believing them. I also wasn't believing the fact that James had disappeared. I'd lived most of my life under his horrific reign, and to have him suddenly out of the picture wasn't something I ever thought could happen. "So he's gone." My voice came out barely above a whisper. Samuel lifted his eyes to meet mine. "For now." Before I knew it, A small smile was forming on my face. I suddenly felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from my shoulders and buried deep in the ground. James was gone. He was gone. Even if it was temporary, even if it was under questioning circumstances, he was gone. And that was a day I never thought I'd live to see. Can you please tell me what you're thinking? Samuel eventually broke my train of thoughts. His voice held a touch of concern and apprehension. It was only then I realized my face was morphed into an unreadable and half-mad expression. My eyes were wide, my jaw was open, and I was staring blankly at the space in between Samuel and me. I tried and failed miserably to form words, but that didn't stop a wide smile from spreading to my ears. Yeah, I mean you. Samuel let a small smile tug at his lips. It'd be great if you could teach me that language. I don't understand gibberish. I shook my head fervently. Sorry, I trailed off. I don't even know what to say. Well, I guess there isn't much. I just wanted you not to worry. Thank you, I whispered. Words couldn't portray how much this single act meant to me. I didn't care so much about myself, but knowing that my mother would no longer have to live with James was enough to send me over the moon. For a moment, everything else was forgotten and I allowed myself to dwell on the fact that something had finally gone right. Samuel finally smiled my favorite smile. Anytime. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.